Let us see if I have a story in me today. What should the story be about? A fox. Foxes are supposed to be clever, right? How about the story of a fox who lived in a den down by the river? And this fox used to cross the river every day because on the other side was the best hunting grounds. Now, this fox was a bit of a lazy hunter, though. So, he liked to kind of take it easy in the afternoons and try and get his meal just at dusk. And what was his favorite meal? It was little tiny gray mice. Because who doesn't like a good mouse meal? So on this lazy summer afternoon, the fox was lazing around down by the river, and he saw a mouse appear on a raft. Now this is something our fox had never seen before, because mice generally don't build rafts. They sometimes swim, but this one seemed to be on an adventure. The fox was a little bit hungry, so he was trying to decide if he should eat the mouse or not, when the mouse said to him, "Hey, Mr. Fox, how'd you like to go for a wild river rafting ride?" Now the fox looked over at that raft, and he certainly didn't think it was big enough for him, being that it was a mouse-sized raft. So he said, "I think I'll pass on the wild river ride, because I don't think you can provide one." At this, the mouse got a bit indignant, and he said, "Oh, this thing, don't worry. I've got rafts of all different sizes. You just say the word, and I'll radio back, and we'll get the big fox-sized raft." To which the fox says, "What's a radio?" Being that animals didn't have radios. He was a bit confused by the whole thing. So the mouse proceeded to explain to him the basics of radio communication, which took a while because radio communication was unknown to the fox, until he eventually got it. And he said, "All right, radio on and get me that raft that's fox-sized." So that's exactly what the mouse did. And pretty soon, down the river came a fox-sized raft, manned or moused by a whole crew of mice. They were fighting the rapids. They were steering around rocks. They looked like an experienced crew of raftsmen, or rafts mice. So they pulled up alongside the lazy old fox, who thought to himself, this could be an easy lunch for me. But the excitement of a river raft ride seemed more enticing to him at the moment. So he got on the raft. Now the fox never thought he was in danger, because he knew how to swim. And, after all, they were just mice. But he didn't know that the mice had tasers. Why? Because animals don't have tasers. So he got on feeling perfectly safe, and enjoyed himself a nice little ride down the river on this raft. But when he got to a certain point, the mice stopped the ride and said, "Okay, it's time to get off the raft now. It's all over." To which the fox said, "What? No dinner with this river ride?" Of course, the mice knew that was a threat, because the fox liked little gray mice best. So they said, "Listen, buddy, we know you're a big bad fox, but we got tasers. So don't you go try eating any of us." Of course, the fox said, "What's a taser?" And then he got tased. Waking up a little while later in the dark, the fox found himself alone in a field not far from his den off the river, and said to himself, "Well, I don't like tasers." And that's when he heard a voice in the trees that he knew to be an owl, saying, "Taser? Where'd you learn about tasers?" To which the fox said, "From the mice." And the owl said, "Mice aren't supposed to know about tasers. There's something wrong here." And with that, the owl flew away. That, of course, made the fox even more curious, since he had never heard of tasers. Yet here, mice and an owl had heard about tasers. And he'd never heard about rafts. And though he wasn't sure the owl knew about the raft, he knew the mice knew about rafts. So he decided it was time that he saw a little more of the world. So this fox went back to his den and said, maybe I should pack up some of my stuff and go on a little trip. That way, I can see a little more of the world and learn all about fancy new things like rafts and tasers. So the fox looked around at his stuff and wondered what to bring, because it turned out he really didn't have much. I mean, what does a fox need besides a nice little hidey hole to sleep in? He actually had a blanket. He knew what one of those was because he stole it from a house one night. Because though the fox spent most of his time in the woods, he knew where at least one house was where he could occasionally get an easy meal of a chicken. So he said, "You know what? Maybe I should bring my blanket with me, because you never know how cold it's going to get there out in the world." So he looked at his blanket, and he wondered, how do you bring a blanket with you? Because being a fox, he didn't know about suitcases, and he didn't know about packing, and he didn't know how to fold a blanket. So much like many other poor travelers before him, he just crumpled it up into a ball. And as we all know, the ball isn't the most efficient means of packing a blanket. So he picked it up in his jaws and was going to carry it with him when he decided, you know what, it's really too hard to breathe with a blanket in your jaws. So he put it down, and it being his only possession, decided he didn't need anything to go on his trip. He had his wits. He was one of the smarter animals. So he figured if mice could figure out things like rafts, surely he could. So then he decided to see if he could build a little raft himself. He saw how it was done. There were some branches that seemed to be tied together with some sort of vines. And it was sure getting dark out. But he said, you know what? I can find a few branches. So we went around and gathered up some branches, put them all in one big pile, then went out to look for some vines. He found himself some vines, looked at it all, and said, how do you tie this all together? Because he was a fox after all he had was his paws. And paws don't make very good hands. So then he decided, enough with the raft. And just dropped the sticks one by one into the river and watched them float away. And this got him thinking about swimming. He knew he could swim across the river, but he wasn't sure how far he could swim down the river. So he decided to test himself out. And he swam across the river once, and he swam across the river twice, and he swam across the river 12 times until he was too tired to swim anymore. So that is when he sat down on the riverbank and thought to himself again, do I really want to go on this trip? And as he sat there, he saw a little gray rabbit walk up near him. And he said to himself, I'm kinda hungry. If I chase that rabbit, maybe I can get myself a meal. Then the rabbit perked up its ears and froze as it looked over at him. As the fox stood up to chase the rabbit, to get himself a bite to eat, the rabbit dashed off and the fox just stood there. He was too tired from swimming. And that's when he said, Trip, I don't need to take a trip. I'm just going to stay here and wait till tomorrow when another little mouse will come my way and I'll have a meal. And he ended up not going anywhere because after all, he was a lazy fox.